You're listening to Innovators, the podcast from Harris Search Associates, where we speak with global leaders in education, research, engineering, and the health sciences, and ask them to share lessons learned as they continue to advance the frontiers of innovation and discovery. Today's podcast will be led by Rick Skinner, Senior Consultant.
The nature and extent of climate change has been fiercely debated and contested. The ends to which some disputants would go was captured in part by the BBC film, The Trick, that appeared in late 2021. Based on actual events and real people, The Trick tells the story of how results from years of scientific research done by Professor Philip Jones of East Anglia University to document climate change were first hacked and then used selectively to challenge publicly the veracity and the validity of Jones' findings that the Earth's climate had changed dramatically and was warming rapidly since the advent of industrialization, in particular, the use of fossil fuels. 12 years later, and that defamation of Professor Jones and his research culminate in their vindication. In an October 10, 2021 issue of the Guardian newspaper, Jones is quoted, "The science was strong then in 2009, but it is even stronger now. And the voices of his critics are heard less often. Indeed, one hears more frequently that climate change is the existential threat to the world. But if the science of climate change is more accepted and the words about the need to act to deal with its consequences are more urgent, action on a scale equivalent to the threat has not yet occurred. So on Innovators today, we do explore why action does not yet match the apparent threat of climate change. Why hasn't the science been translated into decisions, policies, and means for dealing with the consequences of this existential threat? We have with us Dr. James Arnott, Executive Director of the Aspen Global Change Institute. AGCI was founded in 1989 as an outgrowth of a NASA-funded workshop and operated as a nonprofit research and education organization under the auspices of the WinStar Foundation until 1995. It continues today as a convener of people and organizations engaged in Earth system science and solutions, a community the Institute helped to nurture through workshops, research, and advice to practitioners and policymakers. To an observer, AGCI operates on the basis of a straightforward set of concepts. The work is interdisciplinary and global in scope, in which the environment is treated as a system that can be understood using physical and social scientific practices to produce reliable knowledge that can be used to make decisions about how to deal with climate change. James Arnott earned his doctorate from the University of Michigan in the Environment and Sustainability and a BA in Political Science and Economics from Principia College. His research explores how science can become more actionable for decision making. This involves studying how different approaches to collaboration, science translation, and funding can influence how research becomes used and to what end. Welcome to Innovators. A cynic might argue that the simplest and perhaps the most powerful explanation for the lack of progress in addressing climate change effects is the clash of vested interest, buttressed by persistent questioning of the scientific evidence to date as to whether the change observed is a natural occurrence and not something triggered by man-made actions. And in this view, the science of climate change is challenged for its finding and its methods in some cases, but the larger cause for inaction is the more base and basic conflict between those who fear their interests and those of their stakeholders on the one hand will be damaged by the actions proposed by others to address the effects of climate change. In other words, the failure to marshal some sort of collective action in the effort to deal with climate change is a matter of politics and economics, and it's not science. Does the cynical view have any weight to it at all?
Well, I think it's an accurate view. And I would say that, well, first of all, thank you for having me on the show.
Sure.
And look forward to the conversation. So I think that's an accurate view. And I think the reason why it feels cynical is because we as a society operate from, frankly, some misguided notions about how science is supposed to work and how decision making is supposed to work. So let's just take each of those separately and then come back to climate change. So science, and I'll just preface my discussion about science with acknowledging the immense value the scientific enterprise has contributed to society, especially in advancing our understanding of climate change and the alarm. And there's definitely been plenty of reprehensible efforts by special interests to malign the science and scientists. So we have to acknowledge that. But that said, when scientists or policymakers or really lots of different types of people in civil society say that all we need to do is listen to the science, that short circuits the kinds of deliberative processes that I think we as a society want and need. And it puts science in kind of an awkward situation. And so in the course of those deliberations, there definitely should be interests and values and economics, among other factors considered. So I think science can, and my whole work and interest is in helping science to be a better input to those deliberations. But I think we need to recognize that those deliberations ideally are fundamentally guided by values. The late climate scientist, Steve Schneider, who inspired a lot of my thinking, to paraphrase him, he said that science can help us to act on our values in more than a random way. So I take that to heart. Then comes the matter of decision making. And again, here we, as a society, we often operate on overly simplistic ideas of decision making. This idealized notion that we take perfect information and make perfectly rational decisions just does not happen very often, if ever. And so we know this from, for example, behavioral economics, the work of people like Danny Kahneman that show how we have biases and shortcuts that we take as individuals in our decision making. Pretty much any big societal challenge like climate change operates from a standpoint of uncertainty. So we don't always know everything, which further compounds the problem. And then when you get groups of people trying to make decisions together, like in a boardroom or in the Senate chamber or as a national electorate, there is a process of trying to accommodate different values and interests and perspectives on information. And that's all normal. So coming back to climate change, this just accentuates all of those issues. So on the one hand, you have the science that is really robust. So Tony Lazarowitz at Yale summarizes climate science in 10 words. He says, it's real, it's us, it's bad, experts agree, and there's hope. And that fundamental assessment is rock solid, right? So we can take that, but the truth in that doesn't make the implications for action any less inconvenient. And the decisions and actions, I think are needed in response are not trivial. For example, they demand this really swift transformation of our energy system. And even though we really have a clear plan now of how we can do that and how it will actually benefit, lots of benefits to health and economic welfare, that was not always a foregone conclusion. And it's nonetheless a big transformation in society. And that's not talking about all the other transformations, like how do we prepare for rising sea levels, like where you are in St. Michael's, or preparing for extreme heat and wildfires in the Western United States. That requires shifting priorities away from existing priorities, building new capacities, particularly at local levels. So, I'm not sympathetic at all to private interests that have deliberately worked to delay or malign science or stall progress that is really essential for society. I think, you can make that argument quite clear, but I am sympathetic to how great the challenge is of drawing upon science to do the hard work that's needed to address climate change. And it's not as simple as listening to the science.
That makes me think of an old textbook of the 1970s from political science, a book by Graham Allison called The Essence of Decision, in which he tries to understand, if you remember, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he provides three very different models, and they all explain the same outcome, which if you stop and think about it, logically, that's probably not completely false, but it suggests just how prolific people's imagination, not only in terms of their own values, but the collective group of the collective values of a group of people. So it simply magnifies the potential that values are going to have to play a role. So your point's well taken. Now, to what extent does the difficulty of translating and communicating the results of scientific inquiry, does that account for the absence of substantive action? After all, let me just make a point that most scientists would acknowledge that understanding climate change is not an easy task. It's made all the more so because the research that's done is almost invariably interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, if you will. It's done by individuals and groups located in organizations such as yours and universities all over the world. Is it the case that even the best science, the very best science being devoted to climate change, struggles to be interpreted in terms that laypersons and government officials can then comprehend?
Yeah, I think translation is a great umbrella strategy that's needed to make climate science and many other types of science more usable or more actionable. I mean, I like to think about two different challenges that I think are separate, although they're related with respect to translation. So one is more what you talked about in your introduction about when people don't agree or want to agree or try to dismiss scientific knowledge. That kind of denialism is a different category. What you just brought up, I think, is equally interesting and challenging, is when people and organizations are enthusiastically interested in using science and face barriers. So in climate science, for example, there's been quite a bit of research to try to diagnose those barriers to climate information use. For example, climate models chop up the earth in these really coarse grid cells, and those may be too general for informing actions, or may be perceived as too generic for informing actions at a very local scale. Information might be perceived to be too uncertain. It may be inaccessible because it's behind a paywall, or all the kinds of jargon that mask what could be simple messages or clear messages get in the way. I think that what we're seeing with improving uptake of climate information is going a step further than just translating, like simplifying messaging or more one-way communication. It is involving much more of a relationship and an interaction to spur the use of information. So let me give you an example of that. A colleague of mine, her name is Kripa Jagannathan. She's a researcher at Lawrence Berkeley Lab. And Berkeley is one of the places in the country that performs these huge supercomputer models of the climate system. These are publicly funded centers, and they do these models with the expectation that the outputs from the models can, among other things, serve society, inform decision-making. Yet it's been a challenge to actually see that happen in practice in a lot of different settings. And so Dr. Jagannathan, in her PhD work, spent time with almond growers in California, talking to them, interviewing them, deeply listening to them about how they make decisions and what kind of information would be useful and how they would think about climate change. And whereas climate modelers really tend to focus on, or have traditionally focused on, outputs of metrics like global average temperature or regional average temperature, what Kripa started to learn after building trust and hearing and listening deeply to these practitioners, these farmers in California, the key thing for almond growers is a very specific metric of chilling hours. So the number of hours in a day or period of time that are within a certain range of temperature, somewhat above freezing, but below a certain threshold. That interaction then enabled climate modelers to think about what kind of data they're storing on their servers, how to output what they have in a more usable way. I think that is, in essence, a form of translation, but again, it's much more interactive. It's a dialogue, and it's different than just kind of scrubbing a report for jargon. It goes beyond that.
And it strikes me it's also taking some granularity to the information, and then making certain that information is relevant to the parties but also making certain that it can be aggregated up in some way so that you get you get the little picture and the big picture.
Yeah, and it cuts both ways too. Scientists, climate scientists often try to do this work of what's called downscaling, making big general data sets at core scales relevant to local scales. But there have been some decision researchers that talk about what they call decision scaling, which is actually helping decision makers think about how they can utilize imperfect information and make good decisions. So to, think about like your role within the larger system, you may not know everything specific to your locality, but you know general directions and you can adapt your decision-making process accordingly. And so these kinds of translational efforts are really two-way when I think they're working at their best. And that's the kind of thing that I think is increasingly needed to improve the use of this science.
It's interesting you should use the almond example, because I keep reminding myself almonds require a great deal of water to in order to flourish.
Yeah.
Precisely the resource that California doesn't have anymore. And in the absence of that kind of granularity of data from the almond growers, you could make all sorts of policy changes that would absolutely have no relevance at all for them, or could actually hurt their interests. So as you said, both the interest, but also the practical knowledge that they would bring actually helps in the translation of what climate change can mean. So I think the point you made, that this decision scaling is critical, because I can imagine making larger or macro data that have no relevance at all for the individual. So it makes it hard for that for anyone to comprehend and understand. It's a good point. You and your colleagues have talked for some time now. In fact, your dissertation was given to this to a large extent about actionable science as a means for achieving socio-ecological sustainability. And you make the case that different approaches to doing research oftentimes helps scientific results to more readily inform decision-making at a variety of levels of society, and as well as public entities such as government. Help us to understand what actionable science is. How does it differ from what scientists do now, and with what effect? And do you view it as something akin to what I think it was Thomas Kuhn who said it's a paradigm shift in science?
I think about actionable science in a fairly broad and inclusive sense. So I think that actionable science, in essence, is science that is used to inform decisions that improve social or environmental well-being. To bring up your point about the almond example, that doesn't inform what we would call maladaptation, but positive adaptation to change. Accordingly, actionable science, to paraphrase Hugh Grant, is actually all around us, right? It's not a mystery. It's not a rarity. We as a society use science, put science into action in lots of societally beneficial ways in lots of different sectors all the time, across time. So Louis Pasteur, his fundamental chemistry helped to make milk safer, beer better. Einstein's theories have a connection to being able to put GPS in the palm of our hand. So there is a lot of actionability in science already. Even in the climate change context, lots of governments around the world are, to use the phrase I don't like, they are listening to the science, right? They are looking at documents and reports like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to inform really ambitious greenhouse gas reduction targets, these net zero pledges that you see talked about a lot. So that's all true. However, often when we look at a lot of contemporary research that is deliberately trying to improve social and environmental well-being, particularly in a more direct and near-term proximate kind of way, we're often finding that different ways of approaching research are required in order to achieve those desired outcomes.
Is it the time span that drives that difference? That is the urgency with which the research is being asked to produce results? Does that have a major consideration? Is that a major consideration?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I think that there are a number of problems that share, I like to think of them as 21st century problems, but they're not really unique to the 21st century, but they are urgent, they're complex, they are uncertainty prone, they are value laden, and climate change is a great example of all of those things. And so just as in past kinds of emergencies, we need to adapt our institutions, including our scientific institutions, to rise to the challenge. So I think that's all part of it. I think there's also a cultural change, and this gets to your point about the paradigm shift, where some models of doing research still have a role, but they are less satisfying to researchers and to the societies that fund those researchers. And that leads to, I think, new concepts of how to do science. So there was a dominant theory of change in the 20th century that really emerged after World War II, that science, in order to serve society best, should be separate and protected from societal influence.
Exactly.
That it should be, first and foremost focused on basic research, and that if we left science to its own devices, if we gave that unfettered access to really academic freedom, benefits would emerge. And there is definitely a role where unexpected benefits occur from basic research, and basic research is critical in informing our underlying scientific foundation for climate and lots of other problems. But I think that if we want to really take that to the last mile and to the next level, more and more often, more collaborative, engaged, interactive, use-inspired strategies are required, which they don't necessarily shift. It's not a paradigm shift in exactly the way Kuhn talked about, like changing a different theory of how the world works,
right?
The physical world works. It's more actually kind of adopting at least a more expansive understanding of how science works and relates to society.
And would it be unfair to say that there is some sociology to the actual doing of science that we probably need to understand better than we've ever had to do it in the past? Because, as you said, the model that came out of the Second World War, largely based on the atomic bomb and that research, that you need to kind of hurdle away, that probably created a situation where the expectations of what science could do, whether it was by serendipity or not, would be far greater. And in point of fact, what we found is that science could be rejected largely on the grounds that no consideration was given to what that knowledge would be used for. So is there a kind of sociology involved in this?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, I mean, going back to the 1930s, there was this idea of the sociology of scientific knowledge. And that's really where Kuhn contributed. And actually, after the Great Society programs were initiated in the 60s, there was a lot of research on research utilization. That has created, both of those areas create a lot of foundation to stand on. I organize a group of social scientists that include sociologists, but political scientists, psychologists, anthropologists, and a variety of others. We frame our work under this idea of the science of actionable knowledge. How can we build the empirical, not just the what we want to see happen or just hypothesizing, but actually doing studies, empirical work on what are the drivers of actionable knowledge. And a lot of that does confirm this intuition that a lot of people have, that more collaborative, or what we sometimes call co-production, these partnerships between research and practice, are and can be key drivers of actionable knowledge. But we're finding interesting things, like studying the for example, the difference between doing those engagements virtually versus online, virtually versus in person, or how these institutional configurations can scale so that it's not just dependent on one-to-one personal relationships, or to think about some of the equity implications where if your science is totally dependent on people collaborating with you, you're going to have some self-selection where those with more capacity and power are able to collaborate.
Absolutely.
And their voices are at the table and not others. So we have to think about all these dimensions.
And that even acknowledges to some extent that there is a kind of sociological hierarchy within the scientific community that we know is there, but we all too often don't pay much attention to it. I want to go back then and talk a little bit more about Actionable, because it strikes me there's some practical considerations that come out of it. One of which you've already acknowledged, which is it becomes a much more inclusive process. You don't start leaving people out because they're, quote, not in the club or whatever the case may be. I guess the way I'd like to ask the question is a little better. I'd like to pursue this idea in terms of what it means as a practical matter. And here's what I guess I'm curious about. If actionable science calls for scientific researchers who either have experience and or understand perspectives of those persons to whom the scientific results are presented, how might ways change in order to prepare the next generation of scientists? And let me go a little further. Does actionable science in any way risk sacrificing basic research, something you mentioned a moment ago, in order to address applied research for which funding is available? We talked about priorities and the like. And does actionable science create greater pressure on the scientist to have her or his findings influenced by and perhaps prejudiced by the audience that needs the results? That's a complex question, but it really asks, if we're going to be more inclusive and far more interactive, are there some risks associated with that, or does it have any practical implications for how science gets done by whom?
Yeah, it's a great series of questions. And I think, many of those come up oftentimes when we introduce the idea of actionable science. It implies this trade-off, or it implies that one is better than the other, just sort of intrinsically. And maybe that's a fault in kind of the terminology, but I think it's more so a fault in this mythology we have about science in terms of thinking about that as a zero-sum game. So let me start off by tackling the first part about training. I think we need to have better guidelines so that researchers, especially young researchers that want to do this more engaged and collaborative style of research, have the adequate skill sets as part of their professional training to do that. So in addition to core fundamentals and content knowledge, training in how to collaborate across disciplines, just period, how to collaborate, but also with different kinds of stakeholders. That could include training about how to interview, or just frankly to listen deeply, like in the almond grower example. And I think maybe just some broader aptitudes about being agile, nimble, willingness to adapt, to align research with societal needs. Sometimes that does require a bit of humility, or just like self-sacrifice in a sense. And not everyone needs to do that kind of work, but if you want to do that work, and I think right now what we see is so many people are kind of jumping on the bandwagon of wanting to be more engaged, and that's great. Let's make sure that we're all pushing in the right direction with standards and great guidance about how to do that, and preserving opportunities for the advancement of knowledge for knowledge's sake, and fundamental science. There's this idea. I'm really a fan of Vannevar Bush, who was the architect of science funding during World War II, that then wrote a pamphlet on how to design the National Science Foundation coming out of the war. He had this quote in there that says, "Applied research necessarily drives out pure." And that has been taken as gospel, even though there is centuries of evidence from the sociology of scientific knowledge to discredit that. Pasteur, as I mentioned previously, there's this amazing book called Pasteur's Quadrant by Donald Stokes that talks about people like Pasteur who did both fundamental science and advanced applications. And he described that as use-inspired basic research. And you can think about lots of different names, but Pasteur was collaborating with dairy farmers and beer brewers to improve the quality of those products, but also to understand fundamental properties of bacteria and other chemistry. And so that's just one example. In the climate modeling world, a researcher at the University of Washington told me a story. She was a hydrologist trying to come up with better simulations of how water actually moves through a basin. And she was hoping that that product would be useful to water resource managers in the Pacific Northwest. And she talked about this exchange of information with water resource managers who looked at an early draft of her model and said, "You've got it all wrong. This doesn't happen like that. That doesn't happen like that. You got to go back to the drawing board and make it better." And that process not only improved her understanding of the water system, the fundamental science, but it led to a more realistic product that could be used in applications.
That's a fascinating example because I think that it suggests why the interaction is so critical.
Yeah, and look, there is a ton of space for research to go around. And I never think about this issue in terms of changing the fraction of the pie. Let's say it's the budgetary pie that goes to one kind of science versus another. It's really, for me, it's about, okay, assuming there is some fraction of that pie that we want to explicitly say is usable or actionable, how can we increase the likelihood that we deliver on that expectation? So, in other words, if you say you're going to discover, the recent James Webb Space Telescope
Yes,
is not claiming to inform decision-making, right? It is saying we are advancing our fundamental understanding of the universe, and that is valuable. And look, I've spent billions of dollars on that, and I have no problem with that. But when, by the same token, you ask for public resources and say, we're doing this because it will inform decision-making, and you don't incorporate any principles or practices that would increase the likelihood of that work informing decision-making, then I think as a scientific community, we fall short on this kind of informal agreement we have with society that in exchange for public funding, scientists are obligated to provide public benefits. And when you make that claim more specifically that this will benefit decision-making like next year, and you don't know what decision makers in whatever sector are doing next year, then it either is or could be perceived as disingenuous.
exactly. The one thing that comes loud and clear is that you are very uncomfortable, and I suspect people in the work you're doing are very uncomfortable with what they may see as a false dichotomy between a basic and applied research. It may serve a purpose linguistically, but it actually muddles the whole thing because you then find yourself treating each one in idealistic terms, and they probably don't need it, and they probably don't deserve it. Which leads me to my last question, if I could. And I want to go back to climate change, just in closing. There's no doubt that what you've been talking about and your colleagues have been talking about, actionable research, is something that should attract, and I'm sure it does attract, some of the best young minds around. The question for me is, how much does that depend on a certain kind of leader of an organization that sponsors research? In other words, what kind of attributes does someone who oversees a major research organization dealing with, say, climate change, in order for actionable research to flourish in that environment, what kind of attributes does that leader, and from your perspective, what does she lead? What does she need? What does she need to bring with her, and what skills does she need to have?
That's a great closing question. I think it's the kind of question that we all need to be grappling with as leaders of organizations, and especially for those that have the power to select leaders for organizations, boards, funders, et cetera. I don't know the exact right answer, but what it makes me think of is work that's been done to really specify the attributes of boundary spanners. And this is a term for, it could be, sometimes people talk about these individuals as science communicators or science translators, but it goes beyond, like we were talking before, just a communication or translational role. And so Kristen Goodrich is a social scientist, and she and colleagues have really tried to enumerate what are sometimes considered soft skills into much more tangible ideas of attributes of people that can go into job descriptions, that can be the basis for someone's evaluation, just like core competencies in some software or financial management skill sets are considered more hard skills. And so those that come up in this research, which I think might resonate in across all of our conversation in terms of what is needed, are things like empathy. Being an excellent communicator is definitely part of the equation. Emotional intelligence, entrepreneurship. The road is not paved to do this work. You have to, it's a tough road to hoe, and that obligates a certain creative and self-starting kind of initiative.
Could I add one thing to that? I had occasion to talk with somebody about this interview, within the last week or so. And he's an elderly gentleman like me, and he spent years on Wall Street. And he talked to me, and I told him what we were looking at, and I was asking him what experience he'd had. He said, well, we found, for example, that we could bring somebody who was smarter than everybody else in the room about a given field, like, I don't know, bonds and so forth. He said, but what we found was that person could not lead that organization because their capacity was so focused and so channeled that they couldn't see what else was there. So he used a phrase that I'd never quite thought of in this context. He said, we need somebody for whom the frontier is always there. And the best thing you can do is explore. And I always thought that was an interesting kind of geographic notion, because what it suggested, at least to me, was that you know what you do not know, even if what that knowledge is you don't know very much, and therefore you have to keep looking. And so I keep finding myself thinking about the people you're talking about going into actionable research. Is knowing what you don't know one of those components?
Another way to think about that is humility combined with curiosity. But yeah, I think that hits it. I mean, and kind of, I think there's like one of the other ones I had on my list was self-awareness.
There.
And so that I think fits into this idea of being aware of what the unknown is ahead of you, but also what you can bring behind you into that constructively, and not reinvent the wheel. For example, like if everything is, sometimes like in the minds of some people, everything is a frontier, and they realize they just end up doing the same thing over again because they don't realize they're not that original. And so there's that part of it as well.
So in other words, I shouldn't have built my dissertation 11 or 12 times. I probably should have stopped at 2. Maybe that would have been better. James, you're doing some fascinating research. I think it's extraordinarily important. I think it's important not only for what you're doing in the scientific field, it has a lot to say about how policy gets made that can be enacted. And that's right now, because of the stasis we all find ourselves in many situations. I think that may be just as important. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you very much for the work you and your colleagues are doing.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Innovators, a production of Harris Search Associates. We'll have more insightful conversations with global thought leaders to follow.